Imagine waking up and not knowing if you'll survive until the end of the day. Not because of a war, not because of an enemy, but because of where you live. Because in the 15th century, the city that was supposed to protect you was one of the most dangerous places in the world. After decades of famine and the unprecedented devastation of the Black Death, Europe was desperately trying to rebuild itself. Between 1347 and 1351, the plague swept across the continent. It is estimated that a third of the entire European population had died. Families destroyed, cities emptied, a civilization in shock. But humans are stubborn, and in the following decades, people returned. They returned to the cities. They returned behind the walls, because outside of them, there were bandits, there were wars, there was uncertainty, and inside, there was at least the illusion of safety. From afar, a walled city in the 15th century looked imposing. The stone walls rose high. Watchtowers dotted the horizon. Heavy gates controlled who entered and who left. It was a vision of power, of order, of civilization. But when you crossed that gate, the illusion disappeared. The streets were narrow, so narrow that two people could barely pass side by side. The houses were built right next to each other, some even touching on the upper floors. To make the most of the space, the builders tilted the floors forward, each floor slightly more advanced than the one below. The result? Up there, the houses were almost touching, and down below, the sunlight barely reached them. Dark, labyrinthine alleyways crisscrossed the city's interior. No numbering, no map, no planning. You would go in, and you could easily get lost. What if night fell without a lantern, without a moon? It was like walking inside a cave. Now, take a deep breath. No, actually, don't do that. Because the smell of a medieval city was something most of us could never stand. There was no garbage collection. There was no organized sewage system. There were no public restrooms. The trash was simply thrown away, sometimes in the street, sometimes directly from the window. Rotting food scraps, human waste, animal carcasses, all of this accumulated every day in every corner. And when it rained, everything mixed together in a dark, foul-smelling mud, a toxic river flowing through the streets, carrying contamination into homes, into wells, into people. The animals roamed freely amidst all of this. Pigs, stray dogs, and rats, especially rats. They fed on the waste. They reproduced in the debris, and they spread diseases wherever they went. Nobody saw a problem with that. It was simply life. And inside the houses, things weren't much better. Most homes were small, 1 or 2 rooms for the whole family. And family, in the 15th century, was a broad concept. Parents, children, grandparents, uncles, servants, domestic animals. 10, 15 people, sleeping, eating, working in the same space. The walls were made of wood or rough stone. The floor, in many cases, was of packed earth, covered with straw or reeds, which were rarely replaced. And in that straw lived fleas, and in the fleas, LIVED bacteria. The windows were small and covered with fabric to block out the cold, but they also blocked out the air. The atmosphere was stuffy, dark, damp. The fire in the center of the room provided warmth, but it also filled everything with smoke. Respiratory problems were common, almost universal. And when someone fell ill in such a small enclosed space, what do you think happened to the others? There were no hospitals as we know them. There were no doctors available for most people. There were no effective medicines. Medieval medicine was a mixture of herbs, prayers, superstitions, and the theory of impure air. the so-called miasma. It was believed that diseases came from bad fumes in the air, from foul smells, from curses, from divine punishment for sins committed. No one talked about germs. No one talked about contamination. No one understood what really caused epidemics. And this ignorance had an immense cost, because the same conditions that had fueled the Black Death were still there. No change, no improvement, no learning. Water was perhaps the greatest unseen danger. Public wells and fountains were shared by hundreds of people, used for drinking, for washing, for cooking, and also for disposing of waste. The same source that sustained life also extinguished it. Diseases like dysentery, typhoid, and cholera spread through the water, silently, without warning, and people drank, day after day, without knowing, without being able to imagine, that what quenched their thirst could also kill them. And yet, life went on. The markets were teeming with people, vendors shouting about their wares, artisans working at the doors of their workshops, children running between the legs of adults. There was life. There was movement. There was an almost desperate energy, as if people needed to live intensely because they knew that everything could end quickly. And in that crowd, in that tight squeeze, in that constant contact between bodies, there was also danger. Every handshake, every conversation, every exchange of money, everything could be a vehicle for something invisible. The perfect conditions for a disease to spread again. And sometimes it happened. So think carefully about this image. Outside the walls, danger, war, bandits, uncertainty. Inside, overcrowding, disease, contamination, slow death. There was no easy choice. For the poor and the peasants who migrated, the walls represented hope, a chance for work, a chance for protection. But what they found inside was a far crueler reality for many. Those stone walls were not liberation. It was a prison, a place where survival came at a price, a place where death didn't only come from swords or arrows, but from the air you breathed, from the water you drank, from the ground where you slept. Life in the walled cities of the 15th century was a constant balancing act between hope and despair, between the need to protect oneself and the dangers that this protection concealed. And what's most disturbing, people didn't know all of this. They lived like that because it was the only life they knew. They were born within the walls. They grew up within the walls. And they died within the walls, never imagining it could be any different. This is the side of the story that books rarely tell. Not the kings, not the battles, not the conquests, but ordinary people, and the real price they paid simply for existing. If you want to continue exploring the darker side of the story, subscribe to The Dark Reality, because here, the story is told without filters, without illusions, just as it really was. And in the next episode, we'll go even deeper. What did people actually do to survive within those cities? Choices that most people would never imagine making.